Hey, so we are in week 2 of a message series called Prelude. And this series has been, we're just 2 weeks in, but this is a critical series because, as I kind of talked about last week, what I'm actually doing in this series is setting up a whole bunch of messages. Over the next about 10 and a half months, we don't have a firm end date. There's some things still up in the air, but over the next 10 and a half months, I'm going to be doing 31 different sermons, all one big series, broken up into a whole bunch of smaller sub-series. The overarching idea is based on a book called The Story. Now, this is a really interesting book because it is the Bible, but different. The whole goal of this, as the subtitle says, it is the Bible as one continuing story of God and his people. See, there's some problems or some struggles that people often have with the Bible, and we kind of broke that down last week, so I'm not going to go deep on it, but the idea is that for a lot of us, we want to understand the Bible better, but we don't really understand the Bible. And because we don't understand it, it's hard to engage it. It's hard to really get anything out of it, and it can be very defeating. And so the goal of this series and the goal of this book is to make the Bible understandable and accessible through bringing out and putting at the forefront the one big story the Bible is telling. You may not have known that about the Bible, but the Bible, yes, is a whole bunch of small individual stories, but what's actually woven together in all those stories is one big overarching story. It's an incredible story. I think it's the greatest story ever told. And while it can be hard to understand where that story, while it can be hard to see that story when you're in the middle of the book of Leviticus or the book of Lamentations or any number of different books, the reality is there is one story. And so what this book does is it takes the Bible cover to cover, it rearranges some things. It doesn't fundamentally change any of the individual verses or any of the individual words, but it takes it, condenses it, and compiles it in a way that highlights this incredible story of God. There's 31 chapters in the story. They don't even call them books. It's just very different. There's 31 chapters in the story. And so again, for the next 10 and a half months, we're going to take 31 of those weeks and we're going to break down chapter by chapter by chapter by chapter this book. Now, I talked last week about how we're going to have some resources available. Next week, I'm working with the publisher right now. They're actually giving us copies of this book, hardcover, nice copies of this book for $5 a piece. And so we're going to have, I don't even remember how many I ordered, a bunch. We're going to have a whole bunch of copies of this on hand next week, along with there's a study guide that we're going to have some story groups that are going to be meeting throughout this that we'll walk through that. But whether or not you're able to be a part of one of those, the study guide is something you could actually go through on your own to go deeper and to really get a lot more out of it. There's a reference companion that is really cool. You might not all think it's really cool. I think it's really cool. There's a variety of resources. There's also a children's version of the story. There's a teen version of the story. And so we're going to have all kinds of those resources available for you. As long as the publisher is able to get them shipped out, we'll have those next week for you to be able to purchase at cost so that then you can dive as deeply as you want into this journey. We're actually going to kick it off the week after Mother's Day. So we have a few weeks, but this series is kind of setting it all up. This series is giving some background, trying to help us get to the same starting point so that as we jump into the story, hopefully I've answered some of the big questions and dealt with some of the big things that sometimes can hold people back from engaging it fully. So my hope, my goal, not just in this series, but in the weeks to come, is that for all of us, we'll be encouraged, we'll be inspired, and we'll kind of enter into that week immediately following Mother's Day, going, all right, I'm ready to do this. I'm ready to see the story of a Bible in a different way, in a new way, in a fresh way. And my hope for the next 10 months is that for some of us, we'll see the most incredible story that has ever been told for possibly the very first time. And for some others of us who know that story, that we would not just see it maybe for the first time, but that we would be reminded of just how incredible the story God has written is. So all that said, in 1913, one of the most famous poems in history was written. Now, last week I started with art. This week I'm starting with poetry, neither of which are really my jam. all right? But this is good illustration, so we're gonna roll with it. In 1913, one of the most famous poems ever was written. It's a poem that's probably familiar to most of us. For those of us who are past high school age, we probably read it in high school. For those who are not yet in high school, you probably will read it in high school. It's a familiar poem to most of us, but it's very misunderstood. The poem is Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken. Now, I kind of always thought that this poem was about being like courageous and not following other people too much, but sort of making courageous decisions to forge your own path. But that's not actually what the poem is about at all. I'm gonna take a second. I'm actually gonna read this. So for those of you that like poetry, sorry if I butcher it. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden back. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, what this poem is actually all about is not being courageous in every individual decision that we make, but it's actually about how significant those decisions are, whichever one we choose. It's all about how we can really only see so far. Every time we come to a fork in the road in our life, we can only see so far in any direction. And there's twists and there's turns and there's overgrowth and we're left to guess. We're left to take a gamble. Sometimes a more educated guess than others, but we're left to just take a guess and hope for the best. And then as the poem concludes, it talks about how one day we'll reflect on those choices. And we'll be left to confront the reality of the road that we've walked because of the choices that we've made. Now, what I know is that for all of us, we want to be able to look back as we reflect on our life, and we want to be able to see how the decisions that we've made have led to good outcomes, right? We want to be able to kind of, he talks about like sighing. We want to kind of be able to take a sigh and say, okay, it may not have been the road that I expected. It may not have looked how I imagined, but it's been a good road. We want to be able to look back and see, all right, I made some good choices along the way. But the problem is that no matter how hard we try, we can only see so far down the road. And as life gets tougher and tougher and tougher and tougher and tougher, it's harder and harder and harder sometimes to see down those roads. Because in moments that life is really hard, all we can see is kind of what's right in front of us. And as much as we all, at 15, 16, 17, 18 years old thought life was hard then, as we know, it doesn't get easier. And so how do we live in such a way that we're able to look back and that we're able to take that sigh and say, okay, I didn't get every decision right. I didn't take every fork in the road the right direction, but the road was a good road. The Bible actually has a lot to say about this, and it's interesting because where it all kind of centers is on a concept that you may not have heard before in this way, or you may not have thought about before in this way, but where it all kind of centers, and I think something that's really cool, is that the Bible actually kind of has two parallel stories. And as I've talked about already, like there's this book that kind of highlights the one big story, the one grand story, right? But in reality, the Bible kind of has two stories running in parallel at the same time. And understanding this dynamic is crucial, not only to understanding the story that God is writing, but to understanding our day in and day out lives, our day in and day out decisions, our day in and day out forks in the road. The two parallel stories are what for today we're going to call the upper story and the lower story. Now, the lower story is easy to understand. We don't really have to think much about it. The lower story is our story. It's our day in, day out, moment in, moment out existence. It's our experiences. It's our friends, it's our family, it's our moments of triumph and joy, it's our moments of pain, and it's our lives. And so this is very easy for us to understand. In fact, for most of us, we live most of our lives in the lower story, never thinking about it. And because it's our existence and our reality, we don't really have to work to understand it. I mean, sure, there's moments in life that might be confusing, but it just makes sense to us. The upper story is very, very different. The upper story is how things look from God's perspective. Now, this is the story of the Bible. But again, what's so fascinating is that all throughout the Bible, all throughout the story, this book, what you'll find is that God is constantly weaving people's lower stories into his upper story. And so as he tells this one big grand story of creation and redemption and hope and life, there are people just like you and I, with problems just like you and I, with struggles just like you and I, relationships broken just like you and I, pain, all kinds of stuff just like you and I, whose lives are being woven into the fabric of this grand upper story. And so when they come to forks in the road, sometimes they get it wrong, sometimes they get it right. But when we read the accounts of these different heroes of our faith, what we find is that over and over and over and over again, they figure out how to live their lower story, but not stay there. They live their lives in such a way that they are constantly engaging in God's upper story and trying their best to keep their eyes focused and fixed on God's upper story so that the lower story doesn't become all their life is. Now, to show you that, I want to use an example, a very powerful example, I think, from the Bible, a man named Job. Now, this is powerful because of all the different stories in the Bible of God weaving the lower stories to tell one grand upper story, Job's might be one of the most tragic. It might be the most tragic. And then at the same time, at the end, one of the most triumphant. The book of Job is found in the Old Testament, which is the earlier part of the Bible. And the book of Job is all about this one guy named Job. Now, most scholars date the book to somewhere kind of in early Genesis. So as we talked about last week, the Bible is not in chronological order, and the book of Job is no different. It's actually kind of it's kind of middle back of the Old Testament, but it's historically placed very much at the beginning, not that far into the story of the Bible. Now, Job was a good man. As we're introduced to him, we find out that Job is a godly man. He is successful, and he's taken God very, very seriously in his life. He lives right. He's a man who has a lot of integrity. And then, kind of out of nowhere, tragedy strikes him. He has a few different businesses, and he's amassed a lot of wealth from those businesses. And all at once, all of his businesses just collapse. And at the same time, there's a storm, a freak storm that comes through and kills all 10 of his children. Shortly after that, Job gets sick. He has boils that cover his body all over. And eventually we find Job just kind of falling to the ground and sitting in a pile of ashes in mourning over all that he has lost and all the tragedy that has come to pass in his life. Now, if we look at this through the lens of a lower story and an upper story, it's easy to look at this lower story and kind of go, what do we make of this? Like, Job is at a fork in the road at this point. He has choices to make. And what we find is that there are a few other characters in the story. There's Job's wife, who is not a super encouraging figure in the story. In fact, Job's wife says to him at one point, "Why are you still maintaining your integrity? Why don't you just curse God and die?" Thanks, hon. Appreciate that. Here for you too. Then Job has 3 friends, right? So Job's wife kind of takes this approach of like, this is all God's fault. Just be done with him. Job's friends, on the other hand, super encouraging people also, they take the approach of saying, well, Job, clearly this is all your fault. Clearly God has done this all to you because you've done some things that are so terrible that you deserve it all. So you should repent for all the sin in your life. Thanks, guys. I'll be sure to remember this one. And in the midst of all of it, what we find is that Job doesn't take that perspective at all. Now, these are kind of understandable perspectives, frankly. I think they're probably very normal perspectives. In fact, if you've been in the church for any period of time, you've certainly probably heard the second of the perspectives that the friends had. You've probably also had people in your life, whether friends, family, coworkers, somebody, who when things have been particularly bad, you've probably had somebody along the way ask, why do you even follow God? Like, why? If God could do these terrible things to a good person, then what are you doing? They're understandable perspectives, but for Job, they're the wrong perspectives. And so if we shift and look at the story from above, we don't actually have to try too hard to understand this because the whole book is written from the upper story perspective. And so let me give a little bit more context to all these things that happened in Job's life. What we learn early on in the book is that Satan comes to God and he says, hey, listen, that guy who really loves you, Job, yeah, Job. I think that guy is only actually living for you because you're protecting him and you've blessed him like crazy. I don't think he actually cares about you. I think that he's only following you because of all this stuff you've done for him. And God says, no, that's not the case. And Satan's like, yeah, it is. Let's try something. He says, what if you remove your protection from Job and let me mess with him a whole bunch and we'll see what happens. And God says, okay, you can do that, but you can't touch him physically. Do whatever to him, you can't touch him physically. And so as the book continues, we find that it's actually Satan who causes all these terrible things and causes the businesses to collapse and causes the children to die. And Job remains faithful to God. And so Satan comes back to God and he says, all right. So if you let me mess with him physically now, that'll be the thing that does it. Like, I know he's remained faithful to you, but he won't if you let me mess with his health. And so God says, okay. And so Satan goes back and afflicts Job with boils. And all the while, it might seem cruel, might seem unfair. But as we look at the book of Job from the upper perspective, and as we see Job interact with his wife and with his friends, what we see is a man of incredible faith and incredible integrity who keeps turning his eyes back to God. Now, he has some words for God. He doesn't just say, it's all good, because it's not all good. It's terrible. And Job goes to God with anger, and he goes to God with frustration, and he goes to God with pain, and he vents to God, and he begs God, and he pleads with God. And then in one of the most powerful things that happens, I think, in the Bible, God eventually speaks back to Job, and he reminds Job of how big he is, of how big God is, and how small Job is. And it's this moment where, if you want to look at the story through a lens of fairness, it still doesn't seem fair. If you want to look at the story through a lens of justice, it's not just, but it's right. And it's powerful, because as Job is reminded by God, there is nothing that God cannot do. There is no pain that he can't heal. There is no thing he can't redeem. There is nothing that he can't do. Now, what Job decides in the end, he actually decided in the beginning. What Job decides is actually what he responds to his wife with right after she says, why are you still living with integrity? Curse God and die. We find that in Job chapter 2 where Job says, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Should we just take all the good things God gives us and be like, the rest of it, no, don't want that. And crucially, the Bible records that in all this, Job did not sin in what he said. In other words, it was Job's perspective of being able to say, I trust God no matter what, whether it is good, whether it is bad, whether it seems right, whether it seems wrong, whether it is fair, whether it is unfair. In all things, I trust God. I trust God that made Job righteous before God. It wasn't that he didn't feel frustrated, because he did. It wasn't that he wasn't angry at times, because he was. But it was that Job had this ability to say, my life exists down here, but God is on a whole nother plane. He's playing a different game. He's doing a different thing that I'll never understand. But I know that whatever comes my way from him, it's coming at me for the right reasons. I don't know how many of you played sports or were athletes growing up, but I can remember a handful of times in my life where I played against somebody that it was like, oh, they're playing a different game than I'm playing. You know what I mean? Like, I remember when I was a sophomore in high school, the summer going into my sophomore year of high school, I was playing up with our varsity team. I did not play a whole lot because, believe it or not, I was still this height then. But as a sophomore, I was dressing up for varsity. When we would go do summer shootouts and stuff like that, I would go with the varsity team. And my sophomore year of high school, Big Walnut, I grew up in Big Walnut. We were, I think, a D3 basketball school at the time. We had a summer scrimmage against Dublin Scioto High School. Yeah, correct. At the time, Dublin Scioto had a kid on their team named Chris Quinn. Now, that name might not mean anything to a lot of you, but Chris Quinn ended up playing in the NBA for 10 years. All right? Chris Quinn still is a coach in the NBA. Now, our team was pretty good that year, and we had one kid, he was actually the coach's son, he was a senior. He was kind of our lockdown defender. He was a great defensive player. Chris Quinn made it look like he had never played basketball in his life before. And he did it the whole time looking like he wasn't trying one tiny bit. And I remember sitting on the bench just thinking, that's a different sport he's playing than what we're playing. I had a similar experience right before we moved back, right before my family moved back here. We lived in Maysville, Kentucky, which is a little river town about 45 miles southeast of Cincinnati. Now, if you know anything about Kentucky, what you know is that Kentucky is a basketball state. Like, it is. And the little tiny town of Maysville, it's not a big town at all, but the little tiny town of Maysville has actually had a very colored basketball history. In fact, I'm not sure if he still is or not, but at one time, the all-time NCAA three-point shooting leader, a guy named Chris Lofton, who played at Tennessee about 20 years ago. He was from Maysville, Kentucky. And just a couple years after that, there was a kid named Darius Miles who graduated from Mason County High School, who also played in the NBA, like really pretty incredible history. So I got together with a group of guys who played at the YMCA every morning from like 6 to 7:30. So I got in, started playing ball with them every morning, and it was awesome. And then there was this dude that started showing up named Mickey. I didn't know anything about Mickey, but Mickey was about 6'2", and when Mickey just touched the ball, you could just tell he was different. And there would be moments in the game like Mickey wouldn't, he'd kind of be doing things, and inevitably there'd be some kid from Mason County who came in and was playing, and like that kid wanted to show Mickey that he was good. And so he'd try something, and you'd kind of see Mickey like just get this grin on his face. And then about 3 or 4 trips in a row down the court, he would do something that's like, okay, buddy, you just keep playing like you don't care. That's gonna be better for all of us. Come to find out that Mickey played Division I college ball at Wisconsin, was recruited by Bo Ryan to play at Wisconsin. And so all that Mickey was doing in the times where he wasn't doing much was he was just toying with all of us. And when he wanted to turn it on, buddy, he could turn it on. And he made all of us look like we had done nothing in our whole lives on a basketball. The point is, if you've ever played sports, you've been in these scenarios where you're like, oh, that's a different thing than what I'm doing, right? That's sort of what this story is like, I think. We have this way of looking at life as if the lower story is all that there is, but Job has this perspective of being like, oh God, you're playing a different thing than I'm playing. What I see, what I experience, what I'm able to do, when I see what you can do, it's like, oh no, okay. I should not be on the court with you. I should just let you do this because, We like to think that we have the ability to keep up with God, if I could say it that way. We like to think that we have the ability to be wise and to be discerning and to figure things out. But then there come these moments in our life where we realize, oh, no, God's doing a totally different thing here. I had no idea. Job, in the midst of all this pain, of all this struggle, of all this heartache, Job is able to elevate his eyes from the lower story to the upper story. And this pattern is all over the Bible. We exist in the lower story. We live in the lower story. God does not. God is playing a different game. God is doing things. He's working on things. He's up to things that we can't even possibly imagine. And as we see that, if we've never seen it before, first of all, if you've never seen that before, if you've never seen the things that God has done and been like, oh, okay, I got it. The first time it happens, it's pretty incredible. But what starts to happen over your life is you start to realize, okay, God, I'll give you control. God, I'll focus my eyes on you. God, I'll fix my perspective on you because I know that what I see, it's not really what's going on. There's something else. But as humans, we have this gravitational pull toward just grabbing back. And then God shows up again. It's like, oh, okay. Okay, God, I'll give you control. But I want that thing. Okay. Over and over and over. But what we see in Job is that Job was able to elevate his eyes to the Lord. Now, Job never knew about what was happening in the upper story. He didn't know the specifics. He didn't know the details the way that we know them today. But Job trusted God enough to know that God was up to something. And Job questioned God. I mean, he went after God hard at a couple points in time. Now, he never did what his wife said and cursed God and turned his back on God, but he went at God pretty hard, questioning him. But in the end, Job remained faithful to God, and God remained faithful to Job. And as we look toward the end of the book of Job, what we see is that God did some really incredible things in Job's life. In fact, God brought beauty out of all the ashes, and he brought life from all the dead things around him. And in Job chapter 42, it says that the Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. So all the wealth and all the blessing that he had received from the Lord, he ended up with more. It says that he ended up with 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. Now, like, I don't know what that comes to in monetary value, but a lot. Which is a lot. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation, and so Job died an old man, I love this line, and full of years. That doesn't literally mean he was old. It means he lived a really good life. It means that his years were full, not just that he had many of them. So what we see in Job's story, what we see all throughout the Bible is that there's 2 stories going on in your life. There's an upper story and there's a lower story. There's an upper story and there's a lower story. They're everywhere in the Bible and they're in your life. Now, the thing is, just knowing that doesn't really matter. As with most things in the Bible, just knowing it doesn't matter if we don't do something with it. All throughout the Bible, again, this pattern is present, but there's also moments in time where we get some instructions about what to do with this kind of thing. In fact, there was a prophet named Isaiah who wrote this. He said, for my thoughts, this is Isaiah speaking on behalf of God. He says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. There's this fundamental question that we have to ask and answer. Do I want to try to align my life with God, or do I want to try to align God with my life? When we go through life with the lower story approach, that's what we do. We try to make God fit into our lives. We make room for him when we want to make room for him. We prioritize him when we want to prioritize him. We do what he asks when it suits us. But for the most part, we try to fit him into our life. But what Isaiah says here is so crucial. God's playing a different game. And let me tell you right now, when I played in high school against Chris Quinn, and when I played at the YMCA against Mickey, I still don't know Mickey's last name. If I'd have been like, hey, would you do me a favor? Would you just dumb it down a bit? Would you just, would you maybe just not be very good? Like on purpose? Like, would you let me win? Those guys are gonna be like, no, not going to. Some people think that it's like really kind to let your kids win at games. I think that is a terrible thing to do to your kids. I think you should teach them that life is unfair and hard and they're gonna get beaten into the ground. So it's the way it is. I figure at some point they'll beat me at something, that's fine. It's not uncommon at all for me to have a conversation with my kids where, in fact, I just had this conversation with Mason this week. He lied about something. It was really, really dumb. There was this big puddle of water. I shouldn't probably tell this story. There was this big puddle of water on our kitchen table, and there was a water bottle behind it. And Mason was making stop motion. And I was like, Mace, why is there water all over the table? And he went, Mason, did you pour water on the table? No. Mason, why is there water on the table? Dad, I don't know. This is like 7 o'clock in the morning. I don't know, I guess somebody must have done it last night. Mason, water doesn't sit on the table all through the night. I don't know. I mean, it went on and on. I got so mad at him. And finally I looked at him and I said, hey buddy, I need you to understand something. You might be smarter than me one day, but it is not today. You're lying and it's stupid. You poured the water on the table. Doggone it, tell me the truth. Okay. Poured the water on the table. All right. I think back to some of the lies that I told as a kid. My dad never said that to me, but boy, he should have a few times. Like, all right, God, you're playing a different game than me. God, your ways are higher than my ways. Your thoughts are higher than my thoughts. God, I understand that I don't really understand what's going on here. God, I understand that I can't see the whole picture. So God, I'm not gonna try to fit you into my life, but rather I'm gonna try to align myself to your ways. In the book of Matthew, Jesus is asked by his disciples, will you teach us how to pray? And Jesus gives this succinct, quick prayer that is an incredible model for how we should approach God when we pray. And this is how he starts it. Matthew chapter 6, verse 9. Jesus says, this then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Let me paraphrase. God, I want to align my life in the lower story to your upper story. Whatever it is that you will in the heavens, I want it to be that way here on earth, in my life. So the goal is to align our stories to God's story, and when we do that, something incredible happens. The Apostle Paul talks about that in the book of Romans, where he says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. See, here's the thing. When we align our stories to God's story, he makes it great. And so that's what we do with this. You align your story to God's story, and he will make it a great story. You won't make it a great story. He will make it a great story. You can try to align God to your story, And you might have some good things happen. You probably will, because you're smart, you're capable. But God is playing a different game. And when you align your story to his, what God promises is that he will make it a great story. Now, Maria, if you pull up that Romans passage one more time, I do want you to notice there's two criteria in here. One is that we love God. We have to love God. This means that he has to have the utmost importance in our lives. And two, we have to be called according to his purpose. In other words, again, to paraphrase that, I would say we have to align our story to his story, not the other way around. You want God to write a great story in your life, then you can't just focus on your story. You have to focus on his. You have to live in his. And in order to live in his, you have to know his, which is what the next 31 weeks are going to be all about. So what does that mean for us today? How do we do these things? I think simply what that means is that you prioritize your time and energy with God and that you do what he asks you to do. I think it's that simple. Prioritize your time and energy with God. Don't give him your leftovers, give him your firsts. And then just do what he asks. And when you do that, he will make your life into a great story. And you'll be able to see how your story isn't just your story, but you'll be able to see how it's woven into this incredible tapestry of a story that God has been writing for generation upon generation upon generation upon generation. And one day, when you come to the end of your life and you look back at the road you've walked, you'll look back and you'll see choices that you wish you would have made differently. There will be regret. There will be heartache. There will be. There will be things that you look back on and go, oh man, I messed that one up. I see now I should have done that different. There will also be moments that you look at and go, yeah, that was it. That was a hard choice and I killed that one. I got it right. But the only decision that will really matter in that moment is deciding whether or not to continue through life living in the lower story, or whether you'll align your life to God's upper story. And over the next year, again, my hope is to show you that story in a way that is simple, that is easy to understand, and in a way that will give you a filter when those forks in the road come. It doesn't mean you'll be able to see further down the road necessarily, but hopefully it will help you to understand whether or not the decisions you're considering making are stories that are decisions that are in alignment with God's story or just with yours. Because those moments are the moments that make all the difference.